When the last leaves fell and the first frost clung to the earth, survival for the medieval peasant shifted from toil in the fields to a battle against the cold. And in this battle, their greatest ally wasn't a blanket or even firewood. It was architecture. That's right, survival began with how they built their homes. At the heart of this room lies the open hearth, not enclosed, not modern, just a carefully maintained fire pit to keep them warm. The smoke swirls and gathers high in the rafters, eventually escaping through holes in the thatch. But as inefficient as that might sound, this smoke served a dual purpose. It preserved meat hanging from the rafters and kept insects at bay. The hearth did more than warm your bones. It was the engine of life itself. Medieval homes were tiny by today's standards, and that was intentional. Small spaces meant less area to heat. Ceilings were low so that warm air couldn't rise and escape. And doors were often covered with thick woolen curtains to preserve heat and block icy drafts that crept under ill-fitting wooden frames. Walls were made from wattle and daub, woven wooden slats smeared with a mixture of clay, moss, dung, and straw. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't glamorous, but it created insulation. When properly sealed and maintained, these walls kept out wind and held in warmth surprisingly well. Now, let's talk about flooring. Dirt floors were common among poorer peasants, but wealthier ones might use packed clay. In winter, families sometimes laid down fresh straw or rushes, which were regularly changed, not just to reduce odor, but also to add a layer of insulation between frozen ground and foot. Rugs weren't an option, but living with straw meant warmth. And as odd as it sounds, this straw also served as bedding, sometimes moved near the hearth when nights got dangerously cold. But here's the real game changer: livestock. Yes, their goat didn't sleep in a barn out back. It slept with them during these freezing temperatures. Cows, sheep, pigs, depending on your region and resources, were housed in byres, which were often attached directly to the peasant home or even integrated into it. Their combined body heat would raise the internal temperature of a home by several degrees. You heard that right. In winter, your animals weren't just assets, they were living radiators. It might not seem like much to us today, but to medieval families, this strategy was crucial. A few degrees warmer meant fewer cases of frostbite, fewer illnesses, and a better chance of surviving to spring. What's more fascinating is how the fire wasn't allowed to die out. Letting your hearth fire die in the dead of winter was almost unthinkable. Peasants would bank their fires at night, covering embers with ash to keep them smoldering till dawn. If the fire died, reigniting it would be a difficult task. They'd use flint and steel or seek a hot ember from a neighbor. In some villages, a communal fire might be lit for this purpose alone. And what about the air? With no chimney, the smoke filled the room, but not always in a bad way. The upper beams blackened over time and rafters took on the hue of charcoal. But this also meant fewer insects and better smoked meats. Many houses had smoke lofts where sausages, fish, and slabs of pork were suspended over the hearth for preservation during winter. The house became both shelter and smokehouse. Then there's the ingenious use of clothing as indoor insulation. Families didn't wear house clothes. Their indoor wear was as layered as outdoor gear. It wasn't uncommon to sleep in your cloak or to wear 2 or 3 wool tunics indoors. Children were bundled tightly in blankets, sometimes sleeping in drawers or tucked in boxes lined with straw to hold warmth. The cold was never fully beaten, but it was managed, survived, outwitted. The medieval peasant didn't have a thermostat or a gas heater, but through resourceful architecture, careful fire management, and even the warmth of their animals, they transformed a freezing wooden hut into something just warm enough to survive. When the snows came, fields froze and markets emptied. For a medieval peasant, food wasn't something you found, it was something you stored, preserved, and fiercely protected. And if you did it wrong, it meant hunger or death. Let's start by understanding a peasant's basic challenge. They had no refrigeration, ice boxes, cold storage, or even sealed glass jars. Time, instinct, and nature were the only resources at their disposal, and so they became masters of preservation. Every autumn, peasants prepared for winter like soldiers preparing for a siege. But how did they keep food from spoiling for months? The answer lies in 3 core techniques: drying, salting, and fermenting. Let's begin with salt, perhaps the single most important commodity in medieval survival. Salt was precious. It didn't just flavor food, it preserved it. Entire villages revolved around its acquisition and trade. Salted meats, especially pork, bacon, and fish, were staples of the winter diet. Large chunks of meat were rubbed with coarse salt, layered in barrels, and left to cure. The salt absorbed moisture and killed bacteria, essentially freezing the spoilage clock. Peasants who couldn't afford barrels used clay jars or even trenches lined with straw. Once salted, meat was hung from rafters near the hearth to smoke and harden, becoming leathery but edible for months. Smoked bacon or salted herring might not be a delicacy today, but back then, it was the lifeline of February. Drying food, especially in colder climates, was another survival mainstay. The sun wasn't just for growing crops, it was for preserving them. In the early autumn, peasants dried apples, pears, plums, mushrooms, and even strips of meat. These were laid out on racks or wooden planks during dry weather, often in the upper loft of the house or near the oven's warmth. Dried legumes like lentils, peas, and fava beans were especially critical. Rich in protein, they were stored in linen sacks or ceramic pots and used in stews all winter long. Unlike fresh vegetables, these dried goods could survive cold, damp, rats, and time. Bread, too, was part of the drying culture. In harsh regions, families would bake dense rye or black bread loaves in massive batches, drying them until they were hard as stone. They didn't eat these directly, but soaked slices in broth or ale to soften them, turning something nearly inedible into a hearty, life-giving porridge. Then came fermentation. Not just a preservation method, but a boost in nutrition, flavor, and even safety. Let's talk sauerkraut. A simple mix of cabbage and salt, packed tightly into jars or barrels, fermented into a tangy, probiotic-rich food that could last months without refrigeration. It gave vitamin C during the cold season and prevented diseases like scurvy. Though peasants didn't know the science, they knew the effect. Sauerkraut kept you strong. Dairy, too, was transformed. Milk spoiled fast, but it could be churned into butter, or better yet, turned into hard cheese, the kind that could sit on a shelf for months without spoiling. These cheeses were dense, salty, and strong-flavored, but they were reliable protein, often eaten with dry bread or porridge. But preservation wasn't just about process. It was about where you stored things. Underground root cellars were the go-to. Dug beneath cottages or barns, these naturally cool and damp spaces held baskets of carrots, turnips, onions, and beets packed in straw. Darkness preserved color and moisture. Even eggs could be stored in lime water or ash to prevent spoilage for weeks. Herbs were bundled and hung from beams. Garlic and onions were braided and looped on walls. And dry goods like flour or meal were kept in linen sacks, protected from rats with elevated shelves or wooden barrels sealed with wax or pitch. In some regions, special food-safe rooms called butteries or larders were carved into stone buildings. These rooms had thick walls and few windows designed to maintain a steady, cool temperature year-round. What made this all more challenging was rationing. Peasants had to resist the temptation to eat too much during the early cold months. November was tempting. It was after the autumn slaughter and harvest, and stores were full. But by late January, hunger returned like a predator. So families set strict rations. Porridge in the morning, thin stew in the evening. Maybe meat once or twice a week, if that. Children were taught discipline early, and Lent? That wasn't just religious, it helped stretch dwindling stores by imposing a communal fast. When winter came for the medieval peasant, warmth wasn't optional, it was survival. But without modern textiles, thermal underwear, or heated jackets, how did they fend off the bitter cold? The answer: layers, wool, and wisdom. It all started with the base layer, the garment closest to the skin. For most peasants, this was a linen chemise for women or a linen shirt for men. Linen wasn't especially warm, but it had one crucial function: moisture control. It wicked away sweat, keeping the skin dry and reducing the chill that often came from damp fabric. Over that went the tunic, a knee-length or mid-thigh wool garment. Wool was the real hero here. Unlike cotton, which saps heat when wet, wool retains warmth even when damp. It was hand-spun, often coarse and not exactly comfortable, but in the medieval world, comfort was secondary to function. Then came the overtunic or surcoat, a heavier woolen layer sometimes lined with fur or fleece. For the wealthier peasants or village craftsmen, this outer garment might include a hooded cloak or a mantle, a half circle of cloth draped over the shoulders and clasped at the chest. These cloaks weren't just stylish, they were windbreakers before the word existed. And this was the secret: it wasn't about wearing one thick coat. It was about stacking thin layers to trap air that the body would heat and hold between fabrics. While we might think of gloves or scarves as optional accessories, for a medieval peasant, they were survival tools. Hats and hoods were equally essential. The famous liripipe hood, a head covering with a long tail, served multiple purposes. It warmed the head and neck, could be wrapped around the face, and even functioned as a makeshift bag in emergencies. Peasants also wore coif, tight-fitting caps made from linen or wool, under hats or helmets, helping retain body heat from the head, where it's most easily lost. Leggings or hose were worn on the lower body, often tied to a belt or laced to a tunic. These might be made from wool, and the truly prepared wore double hose, 2 layers, or 1 pair with another sewn inside. Beneath these, some even stuffed wool or moss between layers for insulation, especially before heading out to work in snow-covered fields. Interestingly, medieval peasants didn't have a separate sleep wardrobe, nightwear. Instead, they slept in their day clothes, or removed outer layers and kept on the warmest ones. Woolen cloaks doubled as blankets. Sometimes, cloaks were draped across everyone sleeping on a shared bed: parents, children, and sometimes elderly relatives. If resources were available, furs were laid on top for added warmth. Animal skins were prized for their insulating power, especially sheepskin, rabbit pelts, or deerskin. Peasants who lived in colder stone cottages sometimes brought heated stones or clay pots filled with coals and placed them under their bedding to stave off the chill. But fire hazards were real, and such practices required constant caution. But here's a fun fact. During harsh winters, even hats were worn to bed. Keeping your head warm at night was believed to protect your health, and given the science of heat loss from the scalp, they weren't wrong. Unlike modern times, peasants couldn't order a new coat online or buy socks from a shop. Every garment was handmade, from spinning the wool to weaving, sewing, and mending. Families often spun their own thread from sheep's wool, carded and twisted using simple tools. Weaving was done on small looms, and tailoring was basic, just enough to provide warmth and coverage. Nothing was thrown away. Old clothes were patched until they could no longer be worn, then cut down for children, used as rags, or added to bedding. It's hard to overstate how important wool was to the medieval peasant. It wasn't just clothing, it was economy, identity, and protection. Entire villages revolved around sheep farming, especially in places like England, France, and the Low Countries. Wool was bartered, passed, and traded. Lords measured wealth in sheep, and peasants, especially women, spent countless hours spinning, knitting, and weaving. Winter nights weren't idle. Families gathered around the hearth, not just for warmth, but for work. While men whittled tools or repaired leather, women carded wool, spun yarn, or mended garments. Children learned by watching, then doing. They didn't have Gore-Tex or thermal fleece, but they had the wool of their sheep, the strength of their hands, and the wisdom of tradition. And with that, they dressed not for fashion, but for survival. In the Middle Ages, isolation was a death sentence. No one could fight winter alone. Survival wasn't about being tough or rugged, but about being together. Community was the invisible blanket that kept peasants warm. Imagine you live in a village of 30 families. Each family owns a small plot of land, raises a few animals, and depends on the same unreliable growing season. When the harvest is good, the village thrives. When it's poor, you pull together or perish. This isn't modern individualism. It's a network of shared burdens. Let's start with firewood, one of winter's most urgent needs. In most medieval villages, collecting wood wasn't just a personal chore. It was a group effort. Able-bodied men and older boys would head out together at dawn during the last weeks of autumn to gather deadwood, cut fallen branches, and return with massive bundles on sleds or carts. The work was grueling, but shared labor meant faster results and reduced risk from wild animals or accidents in the woods. In some villages, a central fire was kept burning in the green, the communal open space. Here, neighbors might cook or warm their hands, especially during bitter cold spells. Families with failing hearths or new babies could warm themselves without shame. It wasn't charity, it was custom. When everyone's survival depends on heat, warmth becomes a shared responsibility. Food, too, was often a shared affair. The concept of a communal stew pot, sometimes called a pottage pot, was common. Each family might contribute a carrot, a handful of beans, or a bone to the village cook fire. The result was a thin, nourishing stew that changed daily and fed whoever came with a bowl. Women often worked together to preserve food, slaughter animals, or bake bread in shared ovens. Not every home had its own oven. Building one was expensive, and maintaining a fire all day wasn't always practical. So most villages had a communal bakehouse where families scheduled baking times and helped each other prepare the week's loaves. Even dairy was shared. If one family had surplus milk, they might exchange it for flour or dried herbs. Nothing was wasted, and bartering was the backbone of winter economics. If one family had more turnips and another had more onions, they didn't hoard, they swapped. Because tomorrow, the roles might reverse. Before winter began, villages often coordinated the slaughter of pigs, cows, and sheep. Why? because fresh meat couldn't last, and processing it alone was time-consuming and difficult. So, communities banded together. One day might be for the slaughter, the next for curing, smoking, or rendering fat. Every member helped. Children plucked feathers, women salted meat, men smoked sausages. In return, the meat was divided fairly and publicly. Sometimes even the tools were shared. Few families had their own butchering knives, meat hooks, or grindstones. These were borrowed, passed around, or owned collectively by the village. Evening hours in winter were long and dark, but rather than retreat to silence, peasants turned these hours into opportunities for community. Women gathered in each other's cottages to spin wool, weave cloth, or mend garments. These weren't formal gatherings, but they were essential. While hands worked, mouths shared stories, songs, gossip, and news from neighboring villages. Sometimes these events were called spinning bees, precursors to the quilting circles of later centuries. Let's not forget, medieval winters weren't just cold, they were dangerous. Wolves prowled the outskirts of villages in search of livestock or vulnerable travelers. Bandits and desperate drifters could pose threats when supplies grew scarce. And roving soldiers or tax collectors, especially during wartime, could make winter even more brutal. To protect themselves, peasants relied on watch systems. At night, someone might be posted to patrol or ring bells if danger approached. In more organized villages, gates were shut and firelight extinguished early to avoid attention. Over generations, this deep culture of cooperation wasn't just practical, it became identity. Festivals, saints' days, and winter solstice events like Yule were designed not only to boost morale, but to bind the village together with ritual. Children learned early that survival wasn't a solo game. From collecting rushes to mend roofs to helping spin thread or fetch water, even the youngest had a role in the communal wheel. And this way of living, tight-knit, interdependent, resilient, left a legacy we can still see in rural traditions today. The fire that warmed you? It might have been lit by your neighbor. The bread that filled your belly? Baked in the same oven that fed 10 others. The idea of everyone having their own bed is a modern invention. In medieval peasant homes, one bed was often shared by the entire family. This wasn't just about saving space, it was about conserving heat. Bodies generate warmth, and huddling together under layers of coarse wool, straw-stuffed blankets, and fur pelts could raise the temperature by several degrees. Children slept between parents. Grandparents, if present, might share the same bed. In some households, even guests or servants shared the bedding area. Privacy wasn't a concern, warmth and rest were. The bed itself might have been a wooden frame filled with straw, hay, or rushes, or simply a pile of blankets on the floor. Wealthier peasants might own a box bed, a wooden structure with doors or curtains to keep in heat. But for many, it was a pile of fabric and bodies against a cold night. When it's freezing outside and the wind is seeping through the wall, even your grumpy cousin becomes a welcome bedmate. It's also important to note that peasants don't sleep all through the night, partly because of the fire. Fires weren't left roaring all night. That wasted wood and increased risk of smoke suffocation or house fires. Instead, embers were banked, covered with ash to smolder. But by midnight, someone had to check it. Typically, the mother, eldest child, or whoever had the lightest sleep would rise, stoke the embers, add a log or two, and ensure the family wouldn't wake to frostbitten toes. This quiet nightly ritual was a moment of deep responsibility. For some, it was also a spiritual hour, time for whispered prayers or personal reflection. The long nights of winter were filled not just with sleep, but with rituals that eased the darkness. On feast days like Yule, Candlemas, or Epiphany, families stayed up late telling stories, singing songs, or sharing food with neighbors. These were precious interruptions to the rhythm of freezing nights. Candles were lit not just for light, but also for symbolic warmth and hope. Many villages believed that certain nights, especially the midwinter solstice, were thin nights when spirits roamed and saints or ancestors could send special dreams. In these beliefs, sleep was more than biological. It was mystical, part of the fabric of life and death. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't peaceful, but it was enough. In the cold arms of winter, sleep was warmth, family, and protection. A pause between battles, a shared breath of survival. Physical survival in winter was only part of the battle. The other part? It took place in the mind. Because when snow buried the roads, food ran low and daylight disappeared, the medieval peasant had to dig deep, not just into their stores, but into their soul. What kept them going? How did they face week after week of cold, hunger, and uncertainty without slipping into despair? Winter meant more than frostbitten fingers, it tested the soul. Without sunlight, warmth, or assurance of survival, medieval peasants turned to their most powerful asset: belief. Religion filled their calendars with hope. Advent, Christmas, Candlemas, and Lent served as markers of time passing. The church offered not only prayer, but a place to gather, share warmth, and feel seen. Faith wasn't passive. People believed saints could protect their homes or crops. Icons were kept near the hearth. Rosary beads were used like calming rituals, repeated under woolen blankets during restless nights. Folklore ran parallel to religion. Tales of frost spirits like Jack Frost or the Winter Hag personified the cold. These figures punished wastefulness or laziness, making children more careful, adults more disciplined. Songs were essential. Work songs helped pass the hours while spinning wool or preparing meals. Lullabies soothed children who feared the howling wind. Jokes, dark and ironic, became tools for emotional release. But peasants didn't rely on church alone. They had their own myths, folktales, superstitions, and legends that colored their understanding of winter. In many villages, the season was personified. Winter was seen as an old man with a white beard or a cruel spirit who prowled the countryside, testing households. If you weren't prepared, if your firewood ran out or your bread was moldy, he would take you. In other places, figures like Frau Perchta or the Yule Cat were believed to visit homes during the 12 days of Christmas. These beings judged whether families were diligent. Was your house clean, your spinning done, your food shared? If so, you were rewarded. If not, punished. These tales served a purpose. They reinforced values. Cleanliness, generosity, preparedness. They turned survival into a moral drama. Children were especially molded by these stories. They were told, "Don't leave your shoes by the fire or the winter witch will trip and curse us all." It was spooky, yes, but also a clever way to teach responsibility and caution. Psychological survival wasn't about denial, it was about grit. Emotions were acknowledged but not indulged. Hardship was expected, and community reinforced that suffering was shared, not singular. Medieval peasants weren't engineers, but they were masters of adaptation. Survival was less about invention and more about innovation with what they had. Take windows. Glass was too expensive, so they used oiled linen, thin wood slats, or animal bladders. These blocked wind while letting in faint light. Curtains weren't decorative, they were thick, functional, and hung over both doors and beds. Barns were positioned to block wind from homes. Firewood was stacked in curved rows to reduce snow buildup. People even insulated their homes using dung walls, surprisingly effective when dried. Paths between homes were lined with stones to reduce slipping, historical deep dives into the real lives of those who came before us.